All right, everybody. What's going on, man? Peace and power elevation be to all of you. This your girl Tiffany coming through live in effect. So I'm right here on the StreamYard. Make sure if you're on YouTube, subscribe and hit the notification bell and share this channel. If you are on Facebook, you can go ahead and share the video as well. So before I get started, first and foremost, I want to send my condolences out to uh, the actor who played Black Panther, Chadwick Boseman. He has made his transition a few hours ago. So he passed away. He died of colon cancer. So before I want to say this. Please, please, please take care of your health as much as possible. He was only 43 years old when he died of colon cancer, and he'd been battling with it for 4 years. So it's very important that we must take care of our health as much as we can. It's a lot going on in 2020. And it's really not, it's been a hectic year. It's been the most horrible year, to be honest. So, with that being said, may he rest in peace and may he enter into the real Wakanda and may the ancestors greet him with open arms. So, may he rest in peace. All right. So, I want to go ahead and get started tonight. I want to talk about the concept of 40 acres and a mule. So I know people have heard about this a lot and they wonder, well, what is a 40 acres and a mule? What do people mean by that when they say that? Well, 40 acres and a mule was promised to the former slaves after the after the Civil War of the Reconstruction era. It was supposed to be a form of reparation. And as of today, the descendants of African Americans had never received the 40 acres and a mule from the government. However, I want to share some few information, and I also want to share an article that I thought was very fascinating. But I'm going to share some information about 40 acres and a mule. So let's go ahead and get started with the history. Okay. Okay, here we go. So, the concept of 40 acres and a mule. Okay, it's part of Special Field Orders number 15, a wartime order proclaimed by Union General William William Sherman on January 16, 1865, during the American Civil War, to allot land to some free families in plot of lands no larger than 40 acres. Sherman later ordered the army to lend mules for the agrarian reform effort. Okay, the field orders follow a series of conversations between Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton and radical Republican abolitionist Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, following disruption to the institution of slavery provoked by the American Civil War. Now, many free people believe, after being told by various political figures that they had a right to own the land, right, they had been forced to work as slaves. People widely expected to live of land in a quarter session and a mule after the end of the war. Some freemen took advantage of the order and took initiative to acquire land plots along a strip of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida coast. However, Abraham Lincoln's successor as President Andrew Johnson explicitly reversed and annulled a proclamation such as Special Field Orders number 15 and the Freemen's Bureau bills. So, the 40 acre and a mule was promised by the Union General, William Sherman, the same guy that burnt up the city of Atlanta. Yes, he sent his army down to the south. They burnt up various parts of Tennessee. And when they got down to Georgia, they burned up the whole entire city of Atlanta. Hence, you ever want to know why it's called Magic City? Because it went from being a city that was burnt down to where it is today. And if you ever go downtown Atlanta, for those of you ever come to visit Atlanta, you're going to see a statue of a woman holding a bird in her hands. So that represents that the phoenix rose from ashes. Okay, that was Atlanta. So Atlanta was completely burnt down. And they had to start all over again. That's where Reconstruction era came in. All right. So anyway, William Sherman promised the former slaves that, hey, they was going to get some acres of land. They was going to get 40 acres of land, right? Session by session. And they was going to get a mule. Now, and not everybody got a chance to see that opportunity, because after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, right, the next president that came in line was Andrew Johnson. Okay. And what he did, he eliminated all of that. He said, nope, it's not going to happen. They're not getting no 40 acres. They're not getting a mule. So that's what pretty much happened. So the next president did not fulfill the standards, or they did not fulfill the bill. They pretty much annulled it, meaning that they completely erased it out the system. All right. Now it says some land redistribution occurred under military jurisdiction during the war and for a brief period thereafter. However, federal and state policy during the Reconstruction era emphasized wage labor, not land ownership for Black people. Almost all land allocated during the war was restored to its pre-war white owners. Several Black communities did maintain control of their land, and some families obtained new land by homesteading. All right. And we're going to go back to looking at the concept of homesteading. Anyways, Black land ownership increased markedly in Mississippi during the 19th century. Particularly, the state had much underdevelopment bottomland behind riverfront areas that had been cultivated before the war. Most Blacks acquired land through private transaction, with ownership peaking at 15 million acres in 1910, before an extended financial recession caused problems that resulted in the loss of property for many. And it says a 2020 study contrasts the successful distribution of free land to former slaves in the Cherokee Nation with the failure to give former slaves in Confederacy free land. The study found that even though levels of inequality in 1860 were similar in the Cherokee Nation and the Confederacy, former Black slaves prospered in the Cherokee Nation. Over the next decade, the Cherokee Nation had lower levels of racial inequality, higher incomes for Black, higher literacy rates among Blacks, and greater schools attendance rates among Blacks. So, after Blacks, right, who were former slaves of the Cherokee Nations, however, they got a better treatment from those who formerly enslaved them versus those who have been enslaving them for 400 years. So it says down here, the Cherokee Nation had lower levels of racial inequality and higher incomes for Blacks, higher literacy rates amongst Blacks, and a greater schools attendance rates amongst Blacks. Whereas in predominantly white schools, right, it was more segregated. It was more separate or equal type of thing, right? But Blacks did not get the same equality as their white counterparts. And they had poor educational rates. They had poor literacy rates. That's because of the privilege. Now, let's see what else we can find. Okay. Okay, so we're going to look down here at background real quick. The institution of slavery in the United States deprived multiple generations of the opportunity to own land. Legally, slaves could not own anything, but in practice, they did acquire capital, although they were considered the lowest ranking members of the capitalist system. As legal slavery came to end, many free people fully expected to gain ownership of the land they had worked, as some abolitionists had led them to expect. And then check this out. It says African Americans face severe discrimination in the North, even more than the South, and were maintained as distinct racial groups by laws requiring racial segregation and prohibiting so-called miscegenation, perceived as a job-stealing threat to society. They were a downward force on wages, since they usually would work for less than whites, and even more as a dangerous influence on those who remain enslaved. Free Negroes were unwelcome in most areas of the United States. Before the Civil War, most free blacks lived in the North, which had abolished slavery. In some places, they acquired substantial real estate. Okay. In the South, bankruptcy laws had allowed the states to force free Negroes into labor and sometimes to sell them into slavery. Nevertheless, free Africans across the country perform a variety of occupation in a small numbers owned and operated successful farms. Others settled in Upper Canada, now Southern Ontario, and in endpoint of the Underground Railroad, and in Nova Scotia. Okay, Nova Scotia is also a part of Canada as well. Okay. And it says whites did not agree on how free people ought to be treated. Some maintained that the land the free men had farmed for no pay should be taken from their former owners and given to them. Others wanted them sent somewhere else. They opposed the race mixing that allowed them to remain in the United States would bring about. Plans for a colony of freemen began in 1801 when James Monroe asked President Thomas Jefferson to help create a penal colony for rebellious blacks. Okay, and it says the American Colonization Society formed in 1816 to address the issue of free African Americans through settlement, not a resettlement. Not resettlement abroad. Although there was discussion of settling freemen in some undeveloped land in the new Western territories, or helping them immigrate to Canada or Mexico, the ACS decided to send them to Africa, to the closest available land and therefore the cheapest to reach. By 1860, the ACS had settled thousands of African Americans in Liberia. But colonization was slow and expensive and of little interest to most African Americans, who said they were no more African than white Americans were British. Mortality from tropical diseases was ghastly, and while the enslaved population was in the millions, settlers to Liberia were in the low thousands, who had no ties with or interest in Africa. And as mass emancipation loomed, there was no consensus about what to do with the millions of soon-to-be free black slaves. The issue had long been known to white authorities as the Negro problem. All right, so let's start right there. So Some whites felt that black people should have some land after they don't work and labor for so many years. There was those that said, okay, no, they don't need to own land. They need to go somewhere else. And then there was those who made the government has made the agreement to send some black people over to Canada. That's why as of today, you will find out that there is black Canadians, because there are those of them not only descended from those who came from the Caribbeans, but also the descendant of those who came from America. Okay? Especially in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is located in Canada. All right? And also, when the American Colonization Society was formed, they sent African Americans over to a new territory, which is known as Liberia. All right, that's what they sent them over to, as a way to say, here, that's your treat, that's your present for completing your work as a slave. Now that you're free, you can have a land over here. So physically, these black people were free, but mentally they wasn't, because they were colonized. Okay? They were colonized and they were programmed. Many of them was not interested in going into Africa, because all they knew was America. They didn't know anything about African culture or African people. They was long way from home. All they know is America was home to them, but they don't realize that America was not meant to be home to them. It was not meant for them to be comfortable. It was meant for them to labor so they could keep this economic going, right? To make profits for the slave masters. That's what it was really about. But you had slave rebellion and you had abolitionists out there. So eventually, America ended up surrendering and say, okay, you know what? We're not going to do chattel slavery anymore. We got another way of doing it. Industrialization came into place in America. So America realized that, okay, you don't really need slaves. You don't need to do chattel slavery, because we got industrialization. We got machinery. We got all of this good stuff. So the former slaves found work in the North, but they weren't getting paid very high wages like their white counterpart, like they thought they was going to receive. So many of them moved up north because they were trying to find jobs, because they couldn't find many jobs out here in the South, because the South was heavily discriminated against black people. But let's go ahead and continue on. Okay, so it says the idea of a land grant to an entire class of people was not as unusual in the 1700s and 1800s as it seems today. There was so much land that it was often given free to anyone that would farm it. For example, Thomas Jefferson proposed a grant of 50 acres to any free man who didn't already have at least that much. In his draft of a revolutionary constitution for Virginia in 1776, most recently, various homesteads acts were passed 1862 and 1916, granting 160 to 640 acres, a quarter section to a full section, depending on the acts. And earlier homesteading occurred under the statutes, such as the Preemption Act of 1841. Freemen were not generally eligible for homesteading because they were not citizens, which changed with the 14th Amendment in 1868, when they were granted citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which in 1870 gave them the right to vote. All right. So in the beginning, a person who was free, they could not vote and they could not own land because they were not considered citizens. But once the 14th Amendment came about, that changed. And once the 15th Amendment came in, that also changed as well. But let's look up what the Homestead Act was before I Trying to find out. Okay, let's look at what the word homestead is. All right, check this out. So, homestead acts were several laws in the United States by which an applicant could acquire ownership of government land or the public domain, typically called a homestead. Okay, now where's a homestead? A homestead is a isolated dwelling, especially a farmhouse, and adjacent outbuildings, typically on a large agricultural holding such as a ranch or station. Okay. So it says in North America, the word homestead historically referred to land claimed by a settler or squatter under the Homestead Acts or Dominion Lands Act. In Old English, the term was used to mean a human settlement in Southern Africa. In Southern Africa, the term is used for a cluster of several houses, normally occupied by a single extended family. In Australia, it refers to the owner's house and the associate outbuildings of a pastoral property known as a station. So far, the homestead is an isolated location, right? Particularly like a farmhouse or a agricultural area, right? Like a rural town, for example. A rural town is more consist of farming, agricultural. So that would be more like a homestead because it's in an isolated area. So it's like way outside the city and way outside the suburb. It's like almost in the middle of nowhere. So basically, that's what the Homestead Act is just an isolated dwelling. And when they mean by isolated dwelling, that means in law, a dwelling, also residence, or abode is a self-contained unit of accommodation used by one or more households as a home, such as a house, apartment, mobile home, houseboat, a vehicle, or other substantial structure. The concept of a dwelling has significance in relation to search and seizure, conveyance of real property, burglary, trespass, and land use planning. All right. So people was giving permission to be able to own land where they can be able to have their own isolation, or what you call autonomous society, rather. And that was the purpose of the homestead. Now let's go back to the Homestead Act. Okay. Right here. It says Homestead Act were several laws in the United States by which an applicant could acquire ownership of government land or the public domain, typically called a homestead, in all more than 160 million acres, right, of public land, or nearly 10% of the total area of the United States, was given away free to 1.6 million homesteaders. Most of the homesteads were west of the Mississippi River. All right. An extension of homestead principle in law, the Homestead Acts were an expression of the free soil policy of Northerners who wanted individual farmers to own and operate their own farms, as opposed to Southern slave owners who wanted to buy up large tracts of land and use slave labor, thereby shutting out free white farmers. Okay. Then it goes into detail and says the first of the acts, the Homestead Act of 1862, opened up millions of acres. Any adult who had never taken up arms against the federal government of the United States. Let's read that again. Let me highlight that. Any adult who have never taken up arms against the federal government of the United States could apply. That means any adult who never rebelled, who never what's the term I want to use? Who never tried to seek war with the federal government, they were qualified. But if you rebelled or you tried to create a war with the federal government, you was not eligible. So women and immigrants who had applied for citizenship were eligible. The 1866 Act explicitly included Black Americans and encouraged them to participate. But, here we go. But rampant discrimination, systematic barriers, and bureaucratic inertia slowed black gains. Historian Michael Lanza argues that while the 1866 law pact was not as beneficial as it might have been, it was part of the reason that by 1900, 1/4 of all Southern Black farmers owned their own farms. Okay. It says several addition laws were enacted in the latter half of the 19th and early 20th century. The Southern Homestead Act of 1866 sought to address land ownership inequalities in the South during Reconstruction. The Timber Culture Act of 1873 granted land to a claimant who was required to plant trees. The tract could be added to an existing homestead claim and had no residency requirement. All right. Okay, so and then it goes into further details. Okay, so here it is. Now it goes into concept of the intent of the Homestead Act. Okay, the intent of the first Homestead Act passed in 1862 was to liberalize the homesteading requirements of the Pre-Emption Act of 1841. It was signed by Abraham Lincoln on May 20, 1862, as following the secession in the United States. The most vocal opposition in Congress, the Southern states, had been removed. Okay, so its leading advocates were Andrew Johnson, George Henry Evans, and Horace Greeley. George Henry Evans famously coined the phrase, "Vote yourself a farm," in a bid to garner support for the movement. The homestead was an area of public land in the West, usually 160 acres, granted to U.S. citizens willing to settle on and farm the land. The law and those following it required a 3-step procedure: file an application, improve the land, and file for the patent. Any citizen who never taken up arms against the United States after the 14th Amendment was at least 21 years old or the head of household could file an application to claim a federal land grant. Women were eligible. The occupant had to reside on the land for 5 years and show evidence of having made improvements. The process had to be completed within 7 years. Now, the act depleted the Native Americans in the United States of much of their land and natural resources as a result of it being allocated and sold to mostly white settlers. All right. So that's the Homestead Act. Okay. And that's the history of that. Now let me tell y'all something. A lot of the cities that you know today, right, that's known as commercially urban, suburban, they all started off as a rural town. They all started off as a farming town, especially here in the South. So a lot of the main cities, right, they started off as a small town. Then eventually they grew and it expanded. Once the Industrial Revolution started taking place, it helped to grow these cities. And so they went from being industrialized to be more commercialized today. So it expanded over a period of time. But once upon a time, they started off just being a small town, just being a rural town. And under the Homestead Acts, there was blacks who were able to own land, right? They didn't own a lot of acres of land, but they owned something. And they were able to have a farming, do their own agricultural, have their own little set of communities. But many of them didn't have that many land, so they couldn't cross the barriers, right? They had to stay within their perimeter. So if they cross the line and come outside that barrier, outside their community and go into somebody else's community, especially a white one, then it was a lot of problem they was going to deal with. So yeah. Okay, so let me show you guys some sources real quick. It says, context, understanding people in their social worlds. All right. Slavery reparation panic, myth or reality, women in Eastern Europe, photo essay, Chicago last garden spot. All right. And then the title says 40 acres and a mule. What if America pays reparation? And then down here it says cash. All persons that have slaves to dispose of will do well by giving me a call, as I will give the highest price for men, women, and children. And it says any person that wishes to sell will call at Hill's Tavern or at Shannon Hill for me, and any information they want will be promptly attended to. Thomas Griggs, Charlestown, May 7th, 1835. Okay. So let's look at this little information right here. Where it said marching across the Confederacy, 1865, Union soldiers seized large amounts of so-called abandoned property. The Freedmen's Bureau, the administrating agency, okay, the administrative agency for confiscated property, held an estimate of 800,000 to 900,000 acres. Some radical Republicans on the Congressional Committee on Reconstruction hoped to use these properties to provide free slaves with the now legendary 40 acres and a mule as a restitution for slavery. This promise of economic self-sufficiency never came close to becoming law. Instead, the lion's share of confiscated plantation went to the white Northerners who hired the former slaves to cultivate them, in inaugurating the system of sharecropping that disadvantaged so many African Americans over the following century. Not only did former slaves fail to receive significant land or money as compensation to their toil, after the Civil War, Jim Crow regimes in the South and racially biased policies elsewhere led to new institutional barriers to Black economic progress. It's now time to set these accounts straight. Okay. And there's another advertisement right here. It says providing African Americans with the proverbial 40 acres and a mule as a compensation for the legacy of slavery. Politics will answer that question. However, exploring what 40 acres and a mule would be worth today sheds light on how racial differences emerge and persist in America. Okay. Will whites who immigrated after slavery ended have to pay? Would their Black counterparts be entitled to payments? And what about the descendants of Blacks who lived as free individuals during the antebellum period? The free Blacks who owned slaves themselves. The free Blacks who owned slaves themselves. Yes. Yes, you had free Blacks who owned slaves. Yes. I know that's a harsh reality. All right, so you can look up more information. It's called Context, understanding people in their social worlds, right here. So if you want to look up more information, you can just type up 40 acres and a mule. What if America pays reparation? Okay, by Dalton Conley. All right, there we go. Oh, Jesus. All right. So here's another article right here that deals with a 40 acre and a mule. It's by Walter L. Fleming, the North American Review, May 1906, Volume 182, number 594, May of 1906. Published by the University of Northern Iowa. Okay. All right. So it's called 40 Acres and a Mule by Walter L. Fleming, professor of history in West Virginia University. Okay. And then right here, it says, for several years after the close of the Civil War, the Negroes of the South believed that the estates of the whites were to be confiscated by Washington government, and that each Negro head of a family would obtain from the property thus confiscated 40 acres and a mule. Some old Negroes still believe that the homestead and the mule will be given to them. This belief has often, especially in the late years, has been ridiculed as the childish dream of an ignorant people. For it is assumed that the Negro had no reason for expecting land and stock from the government. This purpose of this paper is to show that the expectation of the blacks were justified by the policies of the government and the action of its agents, and also to show that Rascal took advantage of these expectations to swindle the ignorant freemen. Okay. So again, there was black people that had some land, but overall, in general, many black folks weren't able to receive the opportunity to own land. Not many black people. All right. So the people that reaped the benefit of having land were the white Northerners. That's who benefited the most. So it was more so for them than it was for blacks. So basically, black people received a lot of broken promises about acquiring land, getting properties from the government. Now, again, there was those who owned something under the Homestead Act. They was able to own something, but for overall in general, many of them did not acquire property. So which is why we don't have generational wealth. Because the generational wealth that we would have been the 40 acres and a mule. But because that was a broken promise to us, and that was just a bunch of feel-good talk, many black people didn't get a chance to see that, which is why we are dealing with the racial wealth gap as of today. Even if you got black people who are very wealthy because of their fame, the numbers does not line up with those white counterparts. Okay, you got more white people that are wealthy than black people. So you only have a very minority percentage of black folks that has some type of wealth or own some type of land and resources. Whereas a large percentage of black people are still impoverished, are under low income wages. All right. So, yes, that's this article right here. If you want to look up more information, that's the website right up here at the top, jasher.org. 40 Acres and a Mule by Walter L. Fleming, and it was written in 1906. Okay. Now let's look up another source of information. Okay. It's called 40 Acres and a Mule Housing Program and Policies Feedback for African Americans. Okay, so All right, I have to zoom that in a little bit. Okay, politics, groups, and identities. 2008, volume 6, number 4, page 612 to 630. Okay. All right, and the research article is called 40 Acres and the Mule, Housing Programs and Policy Feedback for African Americans. Um, so real quick, let's look at the introduction, and then so I'm gonna look at the first paragraph. All right. So the first paragraph states that the public policy is designed to influence individual not only in terms of policy benefits, but also in terms of general political incorporation. By creating an attachment to government programs, public policies can develop individuals as citizens and can increase their political participation in a wide range of programs. Such participation builds the diffuse support for a political system and creates conditions that are assumed to contribute to the long-term health of a democratic polity. This paper examines the role that the U.S. housing policies play in increasing the participation of a historically disadvantaged group, African Americans. It says historically, the black community in the black community in the U.S. has endured slavery, segregation, denial of equal access to government programs, and direct physical harm. All right. Specific to housing programs, past government programs are known for encouraging redlining policies, promoting residential segregation, and outright denying assistance based on race. Some researchers propose that slavery and other discriminatory programs through the social process of intergenerational transmission of trauma have created a mindset of collective trauma in the black community referred to as post-traumatic slave syndrome. All right. So yeah, it goes into the concept about public housing and the going to the history of the effects of slavery and the concept about 40 acres and the mules. Let's see what else can we find in here. All right, so right here it says policy, feedback, and behavior. Policies are in many ways like institutions. They create an interactive effects between the policy and the participant. Policy feedback focuses on a potential synergy between public policy and political behavior that leads to a process where citizens display feedbacks in response to a particular policy or set of policies. Policies which distributes sticks and carrots to target groups will essentially define who is and is not a member of a political community. By incorporating citizen policy, create a sense of political agency among those who are given benefits. All right, this encourages those affected to participate socially and politically, which leads to future policies and politics that support their self-interest. A critical component of the policy feedback process, therefore, is policy's direct impact on both political and civic participation. Now, okay, that's that article. It's called Politics, Groups, and Identities, 40 Acres and the Mules, Housing Programs and Policy Feedback for African Americans, written by Austin P. Johnson, Kenneth J. Memer, and Kristen M. Carroll. Okay, you can find this out for yourself if you want to look up more information about it. All right. Let's talk about the whole concept of policies. All right. See, if you ever wonder why don't get into the concept of voting and engaging into politics, because it's so many false promises and nothing much really changed. Because at the end of the day, the people that's going to benefit the most is those who are considered privileged, whether they are Democratic or Republican. Okay, so they're the main people that's going to get the attention first. And while African Americans will be the last, to receive any type of attention or any type of help. So for many Black folks, they feel like, well, why should we keep on voting? Why should we keep on begging? Why should we keep on doing this if the system ain't gonna do anything for us? Nothing really changed. The housing conditions still remains the same or at a constant rate. You still got Black people at the lowest, right? You still got Black people who can't get loans for housing or for business at that. You still got the red line policy, gentrification, which affects African Americans because they make up a large number percentage of those who are poorer than anyone else. So now you want Black people to start getting more into politics and thinking that their votes gonna count. Okay, let's say they did vote, but depending on the politician, are they gonna follow through? Are they gonna work on the interests of the people? Or is it just a bunch of gimmick? That's the part that you gotta look at. So I'm all for voting, but the thing is, when it comes to it, it has to be based on the policies, not based on what type of political party that person represent or who they are, but what's their policy at the end of the day. That was mostly matters. And do they have the Black agenda? And one of the things that's on the Black agenda is reparation. That's been talked about for so many years. And if you're not talking about reparation, you're not going to get a lot of vote from Black folks. So the question is reparation on the agenda? Is better housing is on the agenda? Is a better quality of education is on the agenda? What's on the agenda? But anyways, I want to show you guys this article real fast. I thought that was very fascinating. Speaking of being self-sufficient, there were 19 families who purchased 90 acres of land in Georgia to create a city safe for Black people. So I want to show you guys. All righty. Okay, so the website is called Because of Them We Can. So becauseofthenwecan.com, which I think is a very great website. So the title is 19 families purchased over 90 acres of land in Georgia to create a city safe for Black people. All right. And this came out August 26th of 2020. It's called Cooperative Economics at Work. All right. It says in Toomsboro, Georgia, a group of 19 Black families band together to create what has the potential to be the next Black Wall Street. Black people are resilient. We've had to be to strive under systems that weren't built for us. This resiliency has created innovative solutions to impossible problems such as racial injustice, food insecurity, and a lack of secure and safe communities. Okay. Ashley, a realtor in Stonecrest, Georgia, was reaching her breaking point after watching the murder of Ahmaud Arbery in her home state in a Black Vivity OPED. She wrote that she was distraught, and for the first time in her life, she felt disempowered, which caused her to seek help. I sought counseling from a Black therapist, and it helped. It helped me to realize that what we as Black people are suffering from is racial trauma. We are dealing with systemic racism. We are dealing with deep-rooted issues that will require more than protesting in the streets. Scott wrote, it will take for us as a people, as Atlanta rapper and activist Killer Mike so eloquently put, to plot, plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize. So that's what I and my good friend Renee Walters, an entrepreneur and investor, did. So here it is, a sister came together with another individual and 19 and 18 other family members, with 18 families, and decided to buy the land in Toomsboro, Georgia. And they bought 90 acres of. Now let's see what else they did. Okay, so it goes on and says Scott and her good friend Renee Walters spearheaded the Freedom Georgia Initiative, which recently purchased 96.71 acres of land in Toomsboro, Georgia, to establish a self-sustaining Black community. After attending local zoning and city council meetings, Scott said she realized creating a new city would create change and build real Black power. We figured we could try to fix a broken system, or we could start fresh. Start a city that could be a shining example of being the change you want to see. We wanted to be more involved in creating the lives we really want for our Black families, she continued, and maybe, just maybe, create some generational wealth for ourselves by investing in the land, investing in creating a community that is built around our core values and beliefs. All right. It says purchase of these sprawling acres come at a time when Black land ownership has shrunk drastically. However, recently Black families have been purchasing large acres of land to combat this loss and create a legacy for themselves. All right, so here it is. That's her and that's her family, her husband, her kids. Okay. So it goes in and talk about the 40 acres and the mules. It says, however, 90% of that land was lost by the turn of the 21st century due to the Great Migration and racist, yet legal and dispossessions of land from Black owners. Okay. There we go. All right. All right, so this is the article that is on becauseofthemwecan.com. All right. And it's written by the BOTWC staff. Okay. And it's called 19 Families Purchase Over 90 Acres of Land in Georgia to Create Cities Safe for Black People. All right, you guys. So I want to thank you all for watching this video. Okay. And with that being said, if you want to go ahead and share this video, you're more than welcome to do so. And make sure you subscribe to the channel, which is Tiffany's channel, or Tiffany French. That's my YouTube channel. So please make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, share the channel if you like. Make sure you go ahead and share this video. All right. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, please be safe. Okay. And I will talk to you guys later. May peace and power elevation be to all you. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much. And I appreciate it. All right. There we go.